Hello, my friends, it's Dan. Welcome back. Welcome to another rulebook review, this time for the Blood and Plunder Core Rules Revised Edition, produced by Firelock Games. And I want you to know right away, this is sponsored content. Firelock sent this to me to check out with you guys. So I'm immensely grateful for their ongoing support, and in particular for taking a gamble on this new rulebook review series that we're doing here. Of course, we reviewed all the plastics in their catalog. Those are all fantastic. I'm eager to take a look at the rules. If you're not familiar with this series, this is these are really flip-throughs, the reviews, but they're really not going to focus on the rules mechanics. I'll discuss them at a high level, especially as they relate maybe in comparison to other rule sets that I've encountered, but there are much better channels out there that are equipped to do things like battle reports and really like a more robust rules discussions. In fact, the Firelock Games YouTube channel itself has a wonderful series of battle reports that are kind of like how-to content, sort of instructional content on how to play the game, which are a great resource if you're looking for that kind of video. Whereas this is going to focus on the physical book itself, construction, layout, print quality, things that I think are often overlooked in rulebook reviews that are out there. This is the revised edition, which I appreciate. Too often there's like the second edition, third edition of a rule set that I feel sometimes is done just to sell a new copy of rules, whereas the revised edition, as the name implies, suggests, as is the case here, that this is really the first edition version of the rules with some errata and maybe some minor rules tweaks within it. So again, I really appreciate their forwardness with that. The original copy of the rules, as I understand it, is a black background with a white ship, whereas this one is this kind of like a white-gray background with a black ship. I think this is a very brave decision from a design standpoint. You can imagine the temptation to have like lots of color, maybe just a picture of a pirate on the front or something like that, something more attention grabbing. But I think this is actually wise because you can imagine this on a shelf next to a bunch of other rule books that maybe are loaded with color, that I think your eye is actually going to get drawn to this due to its comparative simplicity. So I think that it looks really, really good. This is a nice hardback version of the rules, which I'm a big fan of when it comes to gaming aids, because they're going to hold together a lot better. Or even just to have a very nice, high-quality hardcover one for your shelf, and then maybe the softcover book that comes in the starter set would be the one that you bring along to games with you as a reference that you can kind of manhandle. It's 167 pages, if I didn't mention that, and the binding is this really nice sewn type, which is my favorite for a rule book. So a couple things I wanted to state here at the beginning, I think maybe just to color the conversation, that I'm not normally a fan of rules that are of a niche subject matter. I certainly don't mind historical rules. I'm mostly a fantasy gamer. Again, it's kind of a running joke on the channel called We Wargame that I don't actually get out to wargame that much these days, but I do love physical books and I love staying on top of rules. But when I do play, I don't really like things that are small in scope, like whole of Europe kinds of potential conflicts when it comes to historical games. And the Age of Piracy isn't one that I'm particularly interested in. So with those biases out of the way, I state that to tell you that this rulebook is probably the best rulebook that I've ever encountered from a layout standpoint, from a design standpoint. We're going to talk about that from all the details that have led to that decision. But I think this is really going to serve as the kind of the benchmark that I'm holding other rule books against as we progress with this series. And the perfect, I think, encapsulation of that is this very first page. This is just the back of the cover. And you can see that they've included this really lovely map of the Caribbean here, done in the style that continues throughout the book of this kind of like aged parchment look. You can see it continues all throughout. But this is just such a good indicator of me, of the attention to detail, because I think the small details are really often, really with anything, be it film, music, that kind of thoughtfulness, again, the small details are what really define the quality of a thing. And so this book, all throughout, is brimming with small details, small attentions to detail that make it clear to me that this wasn't just slapped together, that there was really a lot of thought that went into the publication of these rules. We're going to see a number of these full-page, sometimes two-page, full-color photos of a gaming table that they've made that must be like the Firelock Studios table, because it is beautiful. It's one that I hope to come visit someday just to see it in person, because it's just so amazing. And again, the quality of the photos is really wonderful. If I can pick it up here, you can see that it's not like grainy, there's no streaks or anything in it. It's really well done. The only thing that's kind of interesting about it that struck me anyway as I was reading it, I've been fighting a cold here. I don't know if you can hear that in my voice, but it's as a result, like I was reading this over the weekend and it was maybe hopped up in a little Dayquil. So it was a little disorienting. Some of the photos are blurred in such a way that it creates almost like a perspective issue, but it really grew on me as we went because I realized, especially with some of the two-pagers, it created the sense of you really like being in the midst of this battle, almost like a Michael Bay panning shot or something like that, like a wide lens kind of thing. That really, it was, again, disorienting is a good word because I think that's the intent of really feeling like you're in the midst of this fight, which is neat. Into the table of contents here, you can see it's an extensive rule set. We're going to get to that in a moment, but I even appreciate this, again, thoughtfulness, that they've got two different types of color to the typeface here, just to add a little bit more visual interest. Credits section up here at the front, which is normally reserved for the back, kind of tucked away behind an index. They've got it up here at the very front, which I also appreciate. And then this is a wonderful, again, another example of just the quality of the print here. You've got this excellent photo of their table that is just so beautifully done. If you kind of squint at it, it looks like a colorized photo or something like that of maybe some reenactment vessels actually in the Caribbean somewhere. But of course, it's a gaming table. And then over here, you've got these illustrations. I think there's one artist that does all the illustrations, and they're very good. They're objectively well done. This is probably my favorite one, not just because it's colored, but all of them have kind of a feeling. It's not normally to my taste, the art style. This feels more like video game concept art to me. But I think that they really fit. They work well, and I like that they're consistent all throughout. And there's a good number of them that kind of litter the pages, which we'll talk about in a second. But again, just kind of take this in for a second, that there's just so much to see on a page like this. Again, all the chapter headers are like this, where they've got a full color photo with a little number indicating the chapter that you're on. Again, this really wonderful background, this parchment, makes it feel like a period journal or something like that. And even this, like little kind of something from an illuminated manuscript. So there's so many little details like this, all littered throughout, that contribute to it feeling like a really wonderful book. Even again, I just noticed this too, this like seam down the middle, again making it feel like an old scrapbook or something like that. So this whole first section that we're kind of flipping through here is as the header up here, which is also another wonderful ad. I like headers just to especially for like a gaming aid to know at a glance what section you're in. This whole first section, as the name implies, is providing some historical context for the age of piracy that we're going to be gaming, right, as part of these rules. And this really sets the scene not only for the scenarios and some of the commanders, which are an important part of the rule set that we'll get to toward the end of the book, but it, I think, speaks to the goal of the rules and the designers, in that while whether or not this rule set is conducive to competitive play, right, like a tournament or something like that, I wouldn't know without like 20 games under my belt. It's clear to me that that's not the intent. The intent is narrative play, immersion. And that's really going to become obvious once we get into the rules mechanics section, that, to me anyway, the complexity of the rules suggests that this is more like a role-playing game that is layered over a warband scale tabletop war game, as opposed to pen and paper RPG or something like that, or even ones with like a grid system like D&D or something like that. That this is more about the story that we're telling. And again, this, you can see it's like 20 something pages of all just history. And I think they have a historian that they used, and we're moving through chronologically here. You can see year by year. I think it started in 1630, moving up into the very early 1700s. This photo, I think, actually is from their cavalry box, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, all of that is to say that it's clear to me that this is all about the stories that we're telling as part of a war game, and I really admire that approach. Again, a really nice spread here going into the second section. This intro section is a little short for me. It really is just this one page. But we saw, again, all that historical context there. We're going to move into the gaming aid section here. It would have been nice just to kind of have like a brief introduction to wargaming generally. Again, I always like that when there's an eye toward people who pick up something like this and have no idea what we're talking about when it comes to tabletop miniature games. So a little section on that would have been cool, but it's fine. We have this intro here that is also explaining from a progression standpoint how they recommend you approach these rules. And we'll see they have an intro section on what you're going to need to play the game. It has the basic rules, then you have the advanced rules. They get more and more complex as we go, scenarios toward the end. And so this is recommending what I would normally recommend, which is you're going to start with the core rules, stop, and then go play a game. So that's exactly what they want you to do, and that's how they've laid the book out. So I really appreciate that. It's a real gamer's perspective on how to approach a new rule set, especially one which the second section implies, and I can confirm, this is a complex rule set. Standing, I think, in stark contrast to, say, Dragon Rampant, which we just reviewed together, even the second edition rules, which are slightly more complex than the first. That rule set I read through once, and I said that I felt like if someone was showing up that afternoon to play this game, I'd be able to muddle through and kind of like teach them the basics of the game. This is the opposite, where I read this book 3 times and I still don't fully understand the rule. I understand like the flow of the game, like basically what we're doing, but I would need somebody else to teach me. That's how I recommend anyone learn a game anyway, is to basically like walk through a game with somebody who knows how to play the game. But this section here is funny because it's clear to me they know that. They know this is a complex rule set. And they do have a wonderful series of videos that they reference here on their YouTube channel that goes through kind of each of these phases of the game, how you do it, and it shows you. I'm a much more like visual, tactile learner that way anyway, so I would find it helpful to watch kind of battle reports explaining what we're doing and why. This is probably the best example of what I was talking about with kind of this perspective, kind of disorienting shot of this photo. I love this. I think this is great and immersive, right? Even though it's kind of blurry over here. It's not a criticism. It really does make it feel like almost dizzying that I'm in the middle of this battle that's raging. And of course it's a lovely table with some beautifully painted miniatures as well. So this is the Game Essentials section, which is explaining what you're going to need to play a game. And this is the first hint at the complexity that I was just talking about, which is you can see here that the game utilizes D10s instead of what I think many of us are used to, which is a D6. And you can imagine the advantages to a D10 system are the level of granularity that you can get, not only in like things like to hit rolls, but in the profiles that would then back up any of the tables that you would be using for things like to hit rolls. Because that's one disadvantage to a D6 within a game system like, say, Warhammer Fantasy. Within all of the rule sets, I think the old world might do the same thing, I don't know. But with something like, say, Ballistic Skill, if you need a 4+ as a success to hit, and you have negative modifiers for moving, for long range, maybe shooting something in cover, now all of a sudden you need a 7 to hit. So they try to come up with like ways around it with a D6 system of like you roll a 6 to hit, then you roll another dice, and if it's a 4 to hit, now that counts as a 7. The advantage of a D10 system is now you just need to roll a 7, right? So it's very clear that a D10, and I love the dice that they use and they sell on the Firelock sites. These are beautiful. So I might pick some of those up just to have in my collection because they're really lovely. There's also a hint here at the card system that they use. They have some that they sell through Firelock, which you can see are, again, beautifully done. But you can also just use a deck of cards. We'll get to that. There's a whole section on explaining their activation system. But this is, again, explaining what you're going to need to play the game. You're going to need some markers for things like fatigue. There's reloading. Again, there's a lot of complexity within this game system. And as the first section in the intro stated outright, you can ignore some of that complexity. Certainly early on, they recommend that. Just kind of go through the base mechanics of the game. Then you can start layering some of these special rules, things that add more and more immersion to a game. Because that's the truth, that when we talk about complexity in a rule set, it is very much a sliding scale, right? And I'm the kind of player that appreciates a more complex rule set, because if all of this is a simulation, this is all an abstraction. It's a question of how much do you want to simulate in a semi-literal way, right? Because you could have things like there's going prone is something you can do in this game, while other rule sets might just assume that miniatures are going prone or standing up, and that's kind of already taken into account with rules like cover, right? Whereas here it is spelled out as something that you can decide to do. So it's a matter of how much complexity do you want, because of course with complexity comes having to memorize those rules, and being able to reference those rules as you go. I mentioned this is a warband style game, so again, if you have like a skirmish level game, which they have in their Port Royal rules, where you have individual models move on their own, or you have mass battles game, where maybe you've got like 20, 30, 40 models in a unit, this is something in between that. So you can see here, again, we're talking usually about like 6 to 10 models for a unit. This is explaining how unit cohesion works. They have to stay within a certain space of one another. This is also a good example of two things from a layout standpoint. One is that all throughout they've got these columns that they use, which is a great way, I think, to not only add visual interest that makes it feel more like a newspaper or something of the time, but it's also a great way to break up information. I've seen this in a couple other rule sets too, and I think it's always successful if it's thoughtfully done, as it is here. But they also, you can see, have tons of not only pictures, but like figures of what they're describing here, like unit control, the 4-inch diameter circle for smaller units. I think it goes up to 5 inches for larger units. And even here, like this is a good example too of how they can sometimes tactically choose to break up the column kind of paragraphing style with, say, some images up here at the top, just to make it more interesting to read, so you don't have just walls of text as you go. I don't think there's any page that doesn't have some kind of illustration, even if it is something like this. Again, moving into chapter 4 here, talking about activating units. That's something that might have jumped out at you. Again, their approach to this is that you're going to start with gaming aids, moving through the basic rules. Here we're moving into the basic rules on activations and how units operate within the game. And then after that, I think there's a section on like combat. They're going to tell you basically to stop. The only thing that struck me is that I think with most rule sets, there's a section at the beginning on building your army or like building your force. That shows up at the very end of the book and kind of like setting up a game, something like that. So the only disadvantage to that layout here is that the progression can't be as sequential as start on page 1, go to page, say, 70, and then stop, because you have to then jump to the end of the book to learn how to set up a game and build a force. So if they'd included those sections at the very beginning, it would have allowed for, again, a more sequential ordering to how you read the book, where you stop for your first couple of games, and then where you pick up again when you want to start learning about some different rules. So this is where we're talking about the activation system. And we've seen activations in other rule sets like Dragon Rampant, which we just read, where you're rolling a dice to see if they were successful in activating. I appreciate activation systems within a game system that add a little degree of randomness. This is also a nice way to randomize the order that things are, because there's an inherent problem with like the I go, you go system in game systems like Warhammer 40k, for example, whereas if one side is going first, especially when there's guns involved, especially if you get particularly lucky, you can shoot off a bunch of stuff from the other side before they even have a chance to move. So they try to address that with an activation system here. They use cards, which you can see are spelled out here. There's a couple of tables that explain the priority of suits. So you can just use a regular standard 54 cards, including the Joker's set of cards, or you can pick up, there's some from Firelock that are branded, and we saw examples of that earlier on. And then we're talking about how to move units, what you can do when you activate shooting. Again, talking about granularity of things like reloading. So there's certainly going to be people that don't like that. They don't want to have to track whether a unit is currently reloading. And there's, of course, negative modifiers when a unit's reloading. Right, dismounting, repairing things when they're damaged. So you can see, for me anyway, it feels like an RPG through the lens of a warband style game here. Another good example of just such good layout, just to keep visual interest here. Because again, you can imagine not only the density of the text that we're reading here in terms of the amount of words, but also that we're talking about in some cases, pretty dense rules, right? Right, how to crew artillery. There was like spiking artillery on the last page. So it's nice to have that just broken up, not only with these figures, but here's just like to relieve your eyes for a moment. Here's a picture of a dude over here. So now we're moving into the combat section. This is also outlining fatigue tests, which we saw there were markers for in an earlier section of the game. So that comes up throughout, because if you have too many fatigue counters, I think you take like a shaken test. So there start to be some negative modifiers on top of, again, talking about granularity, that different units can have different levels of experience, which play into activation orders. So there's a lot of moving parts to a game like this, which is why I say that reading the rules is great, But until you really start playing some games, certainly with somebody who's experienced in all of these rules and can explain how they interact with one another, I don't think you're going to be able to like just read these rules and fully understand the game. Again, I've read it 3 times now, and I have only a loose understanding of the game. You can see they do a really good job with these overhead diagrams. I think that they do so much to explain what is being described. Especially there's a section on line of sight that I read like 10 times and I didn't understand until I started referencing these figures here that are explaining. Again, it's a nice overhead shot, very reminiscent of like early Warhammer rule books. They would do these like overhead shots. So I think they do a nice job of explaining what it is that is being described in word format here. This whole section here on firearms, this is what I was talking about with line of sight and choosing targets. And there's different types of firearms within the game. So you can see almost in like, it's like the inverse of what we were talking about with Dragon Rampant, where I think Dragon Rampant is providing a very simple rule set for you to then layer on more complexity as you want. This almost has the opposite approach, where it's going in with maximum complexity that I think you could like take stuff out if you don't want to pay attention to that, right? Like if you and your gaming group or you and your opponent like don't care about I keep coming back to the example of like going prone, but if you don't care about going prone, you just wouldn't use that rule. Or if you don't care about the use of like thrown explosives in a game, right? You would ignore that section, and that would be one less thing for you to pay attention to. A couple really atmospheric shots. There's one of like rain later on that is just so beautifully done. So this one, the lighting makes it look like it's late in the day. Just very well done. Now we're in the whole section of terrain here. So this is a good example of like where you would have stopped. So if you wanted to play your first couple of games of Blood and Plunder, I think you probably would have stopped right around here and just get through the basic mechanics of the game. Because you could see there's even some kind of high complexity even within the basic rules before we get into, like there's a whole section on special rules that is going to layer in even more complexity. Another really beautiful series of pictures here. Again, both serving as examples of what's being described. Like here's some rough, rocky terrain, right? Bridge across impassable terrain being the ravine that they're going over. So it's serving 2 purposes here, both to provide some visual interest, some color, and to demonstrate what's being described here. And I love these. This maybe is the only other thing that I wish maybe they found the space to include is like a gallery section. Certainly like a hobby section would have been awesome, right? On how do you make something like that for the inexperienced gamer. But what is here is really beautiful, even just to look at. Some basics on structures. There's, of course, going to be a whole section on ships, because ships are a big part of the game, if you want them to be. There's, I think there's, when we get to the scenario section, there's 3 ways to play it. There's like land actions. There is like shore action, like, you know, with a ship fighting, and there's, you know, infantry on the land. And then there's sea battles where you'd have to have everybody on ships if you have the ability to do that. So again, moving within a structure. So this is the kind of stuff that, like, if you're a new gamer, you would want to ignore all of this, right? For your first couple of games of Blood and Plunder, you don't need to know about how to move within a structure. Just don't use or just call the structure impassable as part of your first couple of games as you're going through. This is kind of introducing, again, sections of a ship, and there's, as I said, a whole separate sections on ships and hulls. And it's clear to me anyway, this is where you start getting the feeling of what I had by the end of the rules, which is that the level of complexity within this game almost create games within the game when it comes to like moving a ship around. Again, we'll get to that section. Or even like the mini game that is the card activation system, right? All of this is stuff to keep track of, things to pay attention to, certainly. But they're almost like mini games to win when it comes to like outmaneuvering your opponent from a ship standpoint. There's, of course, random stuff that can affect things like steerage, etc. A whole section dedicated to just artillery. Again, the kind of thing that you would want to ignore for your first couple of games. Another beautiful shot here of this wonderful table that they're on. That also, like I said at the very beginning of this review, that like I don't normally care about the age of piracy, but these photos really exemplify I like the reason I think these are so important and so atmospheric is because they make me want to play this game, right? Even though I'm the kind of person that, as I said, don't really care about niche conflicts or comparatively niche conflicts. I look at something like this and it's so aspirational that I'm like, I want to play that game, right? It looks like a lot of fun. Again, a whole section on artillery, how crews work, how if you get engaged in combat, how that's going to work. The kind of thing that you can add more or less of this complexity as you're going on, but certainly is not the kind of thing that you want to deal with straight away. What happens if you target structures, because terrain can get impacted by artillery, just as you would imagine like ships can get impacted by artillery. That's a big part of it. Swivel guns, another beautiful shot here. Still in the artillery section, there's a breakdown on different types of shot that you can load your artillery with. And even this, going back to my point about like an RPG, like this straight up looks like like a table that would exist within an RPG, right? If you've ever played any like pen and paper RPGs and you have like a quick reference sheet for all the different types of weapon and damage that they do and ranges, that's kind of the vibe that I get from that right there. Here's the section on ships that I had talked about. These I don't think are the ships that they sell. Or they might be the resin versions, but the plastic ship that we reviewed, which is fantastic, you should definitely go check out the review if you've not, and it's so reasonably priced, is really, really cool to have, even if you're not playing Blood and Plunder. It's a great set. So again, game within a game, right? Here's the whole section on ships, how you move ships, how wind affects ships, right? You've got things like steering with oars, drifting, how the wind's going to impact the ship. And again, this can happen even with like a near shore conflict, right? So you can have this ship kind of floating around in the water. It's not just going to sit there. It's going to move around. How to maneuver the ship, which can get quite complex, as you can see. There's the kind of the arc of sight is what I would call this. But this 90-degree arc here, they've got some options in the back for photocopying that you could then use. Of course, they've got physical copies that you can pick up on the Firelock site as well. And then there's some random stuff that can happen, just like within the activation system. There's a degree of randomness. There's random things here too, right? Even going down to the level of like, how does a ship dock against the dock? Like, how do you roll, or how do you game that? So they don't really leave any stone unturned. Just like again, the level of detail within these rules, I think, is a really good proxy for the detail that we see within the book, right? That the kind of person that would make a rule set this thorough, it makes perfect sense to me, is the kind of person that would pay this much attention to things like layout of a book, ensuring that there's adequate illustrations, like figures of what's being described, right? The difference between a boat and a ship, right? That person that would have that kind of eye for detail, it's clear to me, is the kind of person that would make a book that is this well laid out and this beautifully done. So now I mentioned this is the section that I would expect to see at like the beginning of a lot of other rule books, like how do you create a force. I actually think this makes perfect sense to me. It doesn't work, as I said, sequentially with how they want you to use the book. You would have to jump to this back section in order to like play your first game. However, I actually think this makes more sense normally if it was just a normal rule book to read through, because we see this again, Dragon Rampant being the most recent example. At the beginning of the rule book, and most of the rule books do this too, it like maybe provides a little bit of context for what you're about to read in the rules, but like this wouldn't mean anything to you until you've read through at least the core rules on like what it is that we're doing within the game system. So I think it actually makes a lot more sense to include it at the back as like, now you've read through the rules, you know the basics of what it is we're going to be doing here. Here's how you make a force that we just saw all the rules for. Another beautiful shot here. These are maybe some of my favorite pages. I don't normally like photos that cross, the gutter here in the middle, but this is just so beautifully done. Commanders are a huge part of this game. You have one commander per force. I think it's exactly one. You can't have like a backup commander or anything like that. The commanders have some basic rules to them, right? And then there are named like legendary commanders for each faction as well. So we're going through this section on the Spanish here. I think there are, if I'm not mistaken, there's a number of supplements that you can pick up. They give you more options for forces. I think what's included in the core rules here are the Spanish, the English, and the French, which makes sense as your big three for this period of time here, moving into the English. Again, same thing where you've got the basic rules for if you want to make your own commander with your own name, or if you want to use a legendary commander, they've got some of these existing rules and then some layered special rules as well. We haven't even gotten to this section on special rules yet. But I think this is good. This is nice to include like basic rules for the core factions within this rulebook. So you could just start playing just with this if you wanted to, but if you wanted some more specific factions, they have some supplements that you could pick up for those factions as well. Or I even think like expanded rules for some of the main factions as well. This is giving some more historical background on some of the legendary commanders that they've listed here. And then there are rules on each of these factions for the units themselves. So you can see here some options for Spanish units, explaining a little bit about what they are. This is maybe the only other section that I would have liked to see slightly expanded. This is funny, this is a shot on an actual beach. I think Firelock's based out of Florida, if I'm not mistaken. So it would be no shortage of beaches there, depending on exactly where they're at. So the English section as well. So it would have been cool to have like a gallery. So it is very nice having these, but this is probably the strongest part of each of these sections, where you've got pictures of what is being described. Would have been cool to see like multiple pages, if there was room for it, of like a French force or an English force, etc. Right, a little bit about unaligned factions. Again, I believe there are quite a number of supplements available. They even have like different rule sets for different conflicts. Right, again, Blood and Plunder is focusing on the Caribbean. I think there's one for like the American Northwest as well. So there's lots to see within the Firelock universe. Now we're moving into specific like special rules. This is for like ships, right? But then we also have a whole section on special rules for commanders, for units. These are some upgrades that can be got. You can see there's lots of them here, right? And I think this is a great way to do it, to have like just a whole separate section on special rules, so you know right where to come. There's also an index at the end, which you know I love, but also good to just have the special rules condensed within, you know, a 4 or 5 page section here, so that, you know, if you have used this rule set extensively, you'll always know. Just come between pages like 122 and 130 or something like that. So yeah, you've got the rules for the, you know, special rules listed out here. And you also have a section on weapons. Another really great section here, again, including some more illustrations, which all look fantastic. Very well done. Section on equipment here. Still moving through it. That's maybe the only thing that's like missing from the book, I think, because these illustrations are really well done. Again, they're not normally my style, but I think they fit with this book quite well. Would be little things kind of littering the margins, like just a picture of a pistol, right, or like a skull or something like that over here, just to include a few more illustrations, just to kind of fill the book up. But you can see otherwise there's very few pages that have any of this empty space, and that's like almost the first section we've run into that has any kind of empty space at all. Normally it's filled to the brim. A section on fortune here. So fortune is again, we talk about games within a game. That is a reroll mechanic that is baked into the rule set, that each side starts with a number of fortune points. I think it's 3 to start, and it allows for either like a reroll of a dice or like discarding your activation cards. There's randomness within the game. That's obviously an important part of any tabletop rule set, right? It's not chess. But to include some reroll mechanics baked in, I think is smart. And they can be further modified with special rules. I think certain commanders have it. This is such a cool shot, which is crazy because I don't think that's Photoshop. I think they really did just spray a bunch of water onto their miniatures, which would give me a heart attack. But it makes for a really cool shot, doesn't it? Events, again, games within a game. So like there's things like weather that can impact the game, which makes perfect sense. Again, things like rain, but even like high winds, how that would affect a ship, for example, or affect shots. You know, the ability to, load and fire guns, muskets. And then we come into the scenarios section. Scenarios are such an important part of any tabletop game. I've said before, not even just for like playability reasons, but I think it's an inherently balancing factor, so that you could have even 2 factions that are kind of unaligned from a like power standpoint, but I think a scenario can serve as kind of an equalizer for 2 kind of disparate forces there. So this is talking about setting up those scenarios, and then you've got different deployment types that are tied to different scenarios. So this is like, again, in the Ninth Age world, the fantasy game that I've played the most recently, you would have deployment types and you would have your secondary objectives, and that's kind of what's being described here. So it's how are we deploying like on the table, and what are we trying to achieve within this game. And that's, I think, much more interesting than just set up 12 inches from the table edge on either side and just try to kill everybody, right? That's fun sometimes, but it's much cooler when you've got these kind of unusual deployment types, right? Even just to make it more interesting game to game, that I'm not just setting up the same way. Now I'm gonna, think a little more laterally about how I want to set my army up, and then we're trying to achieve different goals each time. And you can see here too, there's different deployment types depending on what type of game. I mentioned there's land battles, there's like near shore, I think is what they call it, and there's sea battles. So you've got different deployments for all of that. This one here, where it's like a fort fighting a ship, this is very cool. And a little section here on how to create your own scenarios, which is a lot of fun. This is again breaking down different things that can happen within scenarios. Game lengths, reserves, right? All the kind of stuff that would make it to where I would struggle to find like 2 games of Blood and Plunder. Again, given all of the different, like if you're playing a full game of Blood and Plunder using all of the rules, when you consider all of the different elements like weather, the activation system that exists, scenarios, different deployment types, different commanders that have different special rules that impact the game, I think you would really struggle to play even 100 games of Blood and Plunder and have any 2 that were like the same game, just given how different they can all be, right? And you can even have games that have ships or not, right? Like that kind of stuff. So there's just so much to do within this game. Again, I keep coming back to it, that it really does feel like a role-playing game, just done through a slightly different lens. So this is a whole like reference section here at the end, like a quick reference, damage tables, so you don't have to like dig through the book in order to find it. There's actually 2 quick reference sections, so this more expanded one here, right? There's these templates here that you could photocopy and then use for, again, things like unit cohesion, keeping them together. These are the 90-degree arcs that I had talked about that would be useful for maneuvering ships, stuff like that. This index. If you watch my other rulebook reviews, you'll know that I'm a massive fan of an index under any circumstance, but certainly a rule set that is this thorough needs an index, just so that, because again, if it comes up in a game, then I need to know about. It says the unit is exhausted, right? What does that even mean? Here it is, boom. I can find it on page 134, right? So that even though they have the special rules condensed within one section, this is the kind of rule set where you're not just going to be referencing special rules, right? Because the core rules have such a layer of complexity to them that an index is just going to be a wonderful thing to have. So very grateful that they included this section here for easy reference during the game. And then there's this little section here on other stuff available from Firelock. But here's your quick reference section. So you had the kind of more expanded reference section in a couple of pages earlier, and these are just referencing your charts, things like that. So this is like maybe what you would have it flipped open to during the game, and then you could use the index to quick reference some stuff that might come up. And there you have it. So what's the final verdict? I said at the beginning, and I stand by this, that I think this really is the benchmark that I'm going to hold other rule books to, from a construction standpoint, from a layout standpoint. Basically, it checks every box that I would look for within a rule book. So yeah, could it have included like a couple more illustrations of like a helmet or something like that? Sure, but that's a quibble. This is a beautiful rule book. It's well constructed. It's well laid out, thoughtfully done, and it would be a great thing to have in your collection. I'll link that in the description to the Firelock site. I think as of right now that the hardback version of the rules is available for $39. Well worth it for a wonderful full-color illustrated book like this to have in your collection. Even if Blood and Plunder isn't something that you're necessarily going to play right away, it's a great add to your bookshelf if you're the kind of person who, like me, likes to collect rule books, even for games that I'm not currently playing. Massive thanks once again to Firelock for sending this our way. I'll say again, there's a link down in the description to the Firelock site. Go check them out. I'll have a review of the Port Royal rules up here within the coming week or two, which is the skirmish equivalent of this rule set. So I'm very excited for that. Now that we've seen the success of this book, I want to see how that one stacks up. So stay tuned for that if you're interested. Appreciate you dropping by for this one in the meantime. And until next time, happy gaming.